Sometimes the worst night of your life begins with the smallest spark of hope. Emily Carter glanced at the clock on her dashboard and took a slow breath as she parked outside a cozy restaurant in downtown Portland. It was a little after 6 in the evening, and the golden light of sunset reflected off the windows of nearby buildings. She checked her reflection in the mirror one last time. Her light blue blouse was simple, her makeup was minimal, and her blonde hair rested neatly on her shoulders. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just wanted a chance. A chance to remember who she was outside of work schedules, school pickups, grocery lists, and the endless responsibilities that came with raising a child alone. In the back seat, her 8-year-old daughter Sophie smiled while holding a small coloring book. "Are you nervous, Mom?" she asked. Emily laughed softly. Maybe a little. The truth was she was terrified. It had been nearly 4 years since her divorce. 4 years of focusing entirely on Sophie and rebuilding a life that had fallen apart. Friends had encouraged her to start dating again, and after months of resistance, she had finally agreed to a blind date arranged by a co-worker who insisted the man was kind, successful, and looking for a serious relationship. Emily didn't expect miracles. She only hoped for a pleasant conversation and perhaps the possibility of something new. Since her babysitter had canceled at the last minute, she had no choice but to bring Sophie with her briefly until a neighbor could pick her up from the restaurant. It wasn't ideal, but life rarely followed perfect plans. Together they walked inside. The restaurant was warm and inviting, filled with the sounds of quiet conversations and soft music. Emily immediately spotted a man sitting near the front window. He looked up from his phone and raised a hand. Ryan, her date. Emily smiled politely and approached the table. "Hi, Ryan. I'm Emily." He stood and shook her hand. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then his eyes shifted toward Sophie. The smile on his face faded almost instantly. "Oh," he said. "You brought your daughter?" Emily felt a small knot form in her stomach. "Only temporarily. A neighbor is coming to pick her up in a few minutes." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "I wasn't told you had a child." Emily forced a calm smile. "Really? I assumed that was mentioned." Ryan's expression became difficult to read. The friendly energy that had existed seconds earlier disappeared completely. Sophie quietly sat beside her mother, coloring without paying attention to the conversation. Emily tried to keep things positive. She asked Ryan about his work, his hobbies, and his family. His answers were short, distracted, cold. With every passing minute, she could feel the evening slipping away before it had even begun. Deep down, she sensed that something was wrong, though she had no idea that this dinner was about to become the most humiliating experience she had faced in years. Emily tried to ignore the growing tension at the table. She kept reminding herself that first impressions could be misleading and that perhaps Ryan was simply surprised. Before she could continue the conversation, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and sighed. Then he set the phone down and looked directly at her. The polite smile he had shown when she first arrived was completely gone. "I am going to be honest," he said. "This is not what I expected." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What do you mean?" Ryan folded his arms. "I mean, nobody told me you were a single mother." The words landed heavily between them. Emily remained calm. "I have a daughter, yes. Her name is Sophie." Ryan shook his head slowly. "That is a pretty important detail." Emily glanced toward Sophie, who was still focused on her coloring book. "I have never tried to hide it." "Maybe not," Ryan replied, "but it definitely changes things." Emily took a slow breath. She had encountered judgment before. Some people assumed a single mother came with complications. Others believed her life was too busy for a relationship. Still, hearing it spoken aloud stung more than she expected. "Changes what exactly?" she asked. Ryan laughed awkwardly. "Look, I worked hard to build my life. I am finally at a place where I can enjoy myself. I travel. I go out whenever I want. I do not really want to step into someone else's family situation." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Nobody is asking you to." "Come on," Ryan said. "Let us be realistic." A few nearby diners began glancing toward their table. Emily wished the floor would open beneath her. "I thought I was meeting someone available. Someone without all the extra responsibilities." The words hit harder than he realized, or perhaps harder than he cared. Emily looked down at the table for a moment. She had spent years working 2 jobs, helping Sophie with homework, paying bills, and creating a stable home. She had sacrificed countless things without complaint. To hear her daughter described as a responsibility to avoid felt deeply unfair. My daughter is not a problem, Emily said quietly. Ryan shrugged. Maybe not for you. The silence that followed felt endless. Then Ryan pushed his chair back. I think it is better if we end this now. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You are leaving? I do not want to waste your time or mine. Several people nearby were openly watching now. Ryan reached for his jacket. You should probably focus on being a mother instead of dating. Emily felt every eye in the restaurant on her. Sophie finally looked up from her coloring book, sensing something was wrong. Mom? She asked softly. Emily forced a smile for her daughter, but her heart was breaking. Ryan nodded once and turned away from the table. The humiliation was overwhelming. What hurt most was not that a stranger had rejected her. It was that Sophie had witnessed every second of it. For a few seconds, Emily could not move. The empty chair across from her seemed to draw every glance in the restaurant. Conversations that had briefly quieted began again, but the embarrassment remained. She wanted nothing more than to take Sophie and disappear. Mom, are you okay? Sophie asked softly. Emily immediately pushed her own feelings aside and reached for her daughter's hand. Of course I am, sweetheart. She managed to smile, though it felt fragile. Sophie studied her face for a moment. Children always seem to notice more than adults expected. Did that man make you sad? Emily swallowed hard. No, honey. Sometimes people just are not the right match. Sophie nodded slowly, but she did not look convinced. A few minutes later, Emily saw her neighbor texting to say she had been delayed by traffic and would need another 20 minutes. Under normal circumstances, that would not have mattered. Tonight it felt like forever. Emily considered leaving immediately, but Sophie was hungry and had been looking forward to dinner. She refused to let one unpleasant stranger ruin the evening for her daughter. How about we order dessert first? Emily asked. Sophie's face brightened slightly. Really? Absolutely. As the waitress approached, her expression was sympathetic. Can I get you ladies anything? Emily noticed that the woman had probably witnessed most of what happened. The realization made her cheeks warm again. Just 2 slices of chocolate cake, please. The waitress smiled kindly. Coming right up. Across the room, a man seated alone near the window looked up from his meal. He had been there the entire time. Tall, well-dressed, and quietly observant. He had watched Ryan walk away and had seen the heartbreak Emily tried so hard to hide. Unlike everyone else, he was not staring out of curiosity. He seemed genuinely concerned. Emily did not notice him. Her attention remained on Sophie, who was now coloring again while humming softly to herself. Mom, Sophie said after a moment. Yes. I think that man was wrong. Emily blinked. What man? The one who left. Sophie shrugged. He did not even try to know us. The simple honesty of the statement nearly brought tears to Emily's eyes. Maybe you are right. I know I am right, Sophie replied confidently. That earned a genuine laugh from Emily for the first time all evening. At the nearby table, the stranger found himself smiling as well. There was something remarkable about the little girl. Even after witnessing her mother's humiliation, she was focused on protecting her feelings. The stranger glanced at his watch. He had another meeting later that evening, one that most people would never dare postpone. Yet for some reason, he remained seated. Something about Emily and Sophie held his attention. Perhaps it was the grace Emily showed under pressure. Perhaps it was the strength she displayed despite obvious pain. Or perhaps it was the little girl reminding her mother of her worth when she needed it most. Whatever the reason, for the first time all night, someone in that restaurant was not looking at Emily with judgment. He was looking at her with admiration. The chocolate cake arrived a few minutes later, and Sophie immediately smiled as if the difficult moment earlier had never happened. Emily wished she possessed the same ability. She watched her daughter happily take a bite and felt grateful that children could sometimes find joy even when adults struggled. The restaurant slowly returned to normal around them, but Emily still felt the weight of what had happened. She wondered if agreeing to the blind date had been a mistake. Perhaps she had been away from the dating world for too long. Perhaps people saw her exactly the way Ryan did. Before she could sink deeper into those thoughts, Sophie suddenly looked toward the nearby window. Mom, that man keeps smiling at us. Emily followed her gaze and immediately felt embarrassed. The well-dressed stranger quickly looked away, not wanting to seem rude. He is probably just being friendly, Emily said. Sophie tilted her head. He looks nice. Emily laughed softly. You think everyone looks nice. Not everyone, Sophie replied. The other guy did not. That answer nearly made Emily choke on her coffee. A few moments later, the stranger stood from his table. Emily expected him to leave, but instead he walked toward them. Instinctively, she straightened in her chair. The man stopped a respectful distance away and offered a polite smile. Excuse me, he said. I hope I am not interrupting. His voice was calm and confident. I just wanted to say your daughter has excellent taste in desserts. Sophie grinned immediately. Chocolate cake is the best. I completely agree, he replied. Emily could not help smiling. The stranger turned toward her. I apologize if this seems forward. I was sitting nearby and happened to witness part of what occurred earlier. Emily felt her face warm again. I would rather forget that happened. I can understand that, he said gently. For what it is worth, I think you handled it with remarkable grace. Emily was not sure what to say. Most people would have pretended not to notice. His honesty caught her off guard. Thank you, she finally said. That is kind of you. I mean it. Sophie looked between them curiously. Mom is really strong. The stranger smiled. I can see that. Then he crouched slightly, so he was closer to Sophie's eye level. And I think you are pretty strong too. Sophie beamed. I am. Emily laughed despite herself. For the first time that evening, the tension inside her began to ease. The stranger stood again. My name is Ethan, by the way. I am Emily. And I am Sophie, the little girl announced proudly. It is nice to meet both of you. Ethan checked his watch briefly. His phone had been vibrating repeatedly for the last 10 minutes, but he ignored it. The messages could wait. Somehow this conversation felt more important. As they spoke, neither Emily nor Sophie had any idea that Ethan Brooks was one of the most successful business leaders in the country. At that moment, he was simply a stranger who had chosen kindness when someone else had chosen judgment. And for reasons he could not yet explain, walking away no longer felt like an option. The conversation that followed felt surprisingly natural. Emily had expected the evening to end the moment Ryan walked away, yet somehow she found herself laughing at stories from a man she had met only minutes earlier. Ethan had an easy way of making people comfortable. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he seemed genuinely interested in every answer. That alone made him different from most people Emily had encountered. So what do you do? Ethan asked. Emily smiled. I manage operations for a local medical supply company. That sounds like a lot of responsibility. Some days it feels like 2 full-time jobs. And being a mother is the second one? Ethan asked. Actually, being a mother is the first one, Emily replied. Ethan smiled. Fair answer. Sophie giggled from across the table. Mom works all the time. Is that true? Ethan asked. Very true, Sophie answered. But she still comes. To every school event. Emily rolled her eyes playfully. You make me sound better than I am. I am just telling the truth, Sophie said. Ethan watched the exchange with quiet admiration. There was a warmth between mother and daughter that could not be faked. It was obvious that everything Emily did revolved around giving Sophie the best life possible. 20 minutes later, Emily's neighbor finally arrived at the restaurant to pick Sophie up. Before leaving, Sophie hugged her mother and then turned toward Ethan. Are you going to stay? She asked. Ethan looked amused by the direct question. Only if your mother wants me to. Sophie nodded as though she approved. Good. Then she followed the neighbor out the door. As the restaurant became quieter, Emily suddenly felt self-conscious. I hope she was not too much. Not at all, Ethan said immediately. She is remarkable. Emily looked down at her coffee cup. She is the best thing that ever happened to me. Ethan could hear the sincerity in her voice. I believe that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable rather than awkward. It had been a long time since Emily had experienced that with someone new. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Sure. Why did you stay after what happened earlier? Emily looked surprised. What do you mean? Most people would have left. Emily thought about it for a second. Because Sophie was excited about dessert. Because I did not want one rude person deciding how our night ended. And because life already throws enough disappointments at us. Ethan nodded slowly. Her answer stayed with him. Many people talked about resilience. Emily lived it. As they continued talking, the restaurant gradually emptied around them. Neither noticed how much time had passed. When Emily finally checked her phone, she looked startled. I cannot believe it is almost 9 o'clock. Ethan laughed. I was thinking the same thing. Emily stood and gathered her purse. For the first time all evening, she felt lighter than when she arrived. The embarrassment from earlier had not completely disappeared, but it no longer defined the night. As they walked toward the entrance together, Ethan made a decision. He did not want this to be the last conversation they ever had. "Emily," he said as they reached the door, "would you consider having coffee with me sometime this week?" Emily hesitated for only a moment before smiling. "I would like that." Ethan handed her his phone, and they exchanged numbers. As she drove home later that night, she found herself replaying the evening in her mind. It was strange how quickly everything had changed. What had begun as one of the most embarrassing nights of her life had somehow ended with hope. Over the next several weeks, that hope slowly grew. Coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into evening walks through parks and weekend visits to local farmers markets. Ethan never pressured her. He never tried to impress her with grand gestures. Instead, he listened. He remembered small details. He asked about her work, Sophie's school projects, and the challenges of balancing everything on her own. More importantly, Sophie adored him. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan joined them at a community fair. Sophie insisted on competing in a ring toss game and spent nearly $10 trying to win a giant stuffed bear. After several failed attempts, Ethan quietly stepped forward. "Would you like some help?" Sophie crossed her arms. "Only if you think you can do better." Ethan laughed. "That sounds like a challenge." 3 throws later, he won the bear. Sophie cheered so loudly that several people nearby turned to look. From that day forward, the giant bear occupied a permanent place in her bedroom. Watching the two of them together filled Emily with emotions she had not expected. For the first time in years, she could imagine a future that felt larger than simply surviving one day at a time. Yet there was one thing that puzzled her. Ethan was often unavailable at unusual hours. Sometimes he received phone calls and stepped away. Other times he canceled plans because of meetings he could not explain. Whenever she asked about work, he gave vague answers. "Business consulting," he would say. "Nothing very exciting." Emily accepted the explanation at first. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. She was attending a regional healthcare conference for her company. Hundreds of professionals filled the convention center ballroom. Emily arrived early, grabbed a coffee, and reviewed her notes while waiting for the keynote speaker to begin. Suddenly, the large screen at the front of the room lit up. A photograph appeared. Emily nearly dropped her coffee. The image showed Ethan standing beside the logo of Brooks Global Holdings. The announcer's voice echoed through the room. "Please welcome billionaire entrepreneur and chief executive officer Ethan Brooks." Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. Around her, people immediately began talking. Everyone seemed to know exactly who he was. Some discussed recent acquisitions. Others mentioned magazine covers and television interviews. Emily felt her heart pounding. Billionaire? Chief Executive Officer? Brooks Global was one of the largest companies in the country. None of this made sense. As applause filled the ballroom, Ethan walked onto the stage. He looked exactly the same as he always had. Yet suddenly he felt like a complete stranger. And for the first time since they met, Emily wondered what else he had not told her. Emily sat through the remainder of the presentation, but she barely heard a word. Every time she looked at the stage, she saw the same man who had shared coffee with her, laughed with Sophie at the community fair, and listened patiently when she talked about ordinary struggles. Yet now hundreds of people were hanging on his every word. When the session ended, attendees rushed forward hoping to introduce themselves. Emily quietly gathered her things and left before Ethan could spot her. Her phone rang twice during the drive home. Both calls came from Ethan. She let them go to voicemail. By the time she arrived home, a message was waiting. "I know you probably have questions. Please let me explain." Emily stared at the screen but did not respond. She was not angry because Ethan was wealthy. She was hurt because he had hidden something so important. Over the next few days, she kept her distance. She focused on work, school activities, and helping Sophie prepare for an upcoming science project. Still, Ethan remained impossible to ignore. He sent thoughtful messages. He never pressured her. He simply asked for a chance to talk. Finally, on Friday evening, Emily agreed to meet him at a quiet park near the river. Ethan arrived first. The moment he saw her approaching, relief crossed his face. "Thank you for coming," he said. Emily folded her arms. "You told me you were a business consultant." Ethan nodded. "I know. You are the chief executive officer of one of the largest companies in America. That is also true. Do you understand why that matters?" Ethan looked down briefly. "Because it feels like I lied." "Because you did lie." The words hung between them. Ethan accepted them without argument. I never wanted my position to influence how you saw me. Emily shook her head. That was not your decision to make. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan said quietly, the first night we met, every person in that restaurant saw labels. Single mother. Rejected date. Successful businessman. I was tired of labels. I wanted someone to know me before knowing everything else. Emily wanted to stay angry. Part of her still was. But she could also hear the sincerity in his voice. You should have trusted me with the truth. You are right, Ethan admitted. I should have. Before Emily could respond, her phone suddenly rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately felt her stomach drop. It was Sophie's school. Within seconds, her expression changed. Ethan noticed immediately. What happened? Emily lowered the phone slowly. The science lab had a water leak this afternoon. Is Sophie okay? She is fine. But her project was destroyed. Sophie had spent nearly 6 weeks building the presentation. The competition was scheduled for the next morning. Emily felt tears forming. She worked so hard. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he made a decision without hesitation. Let us go fix it. Less than 30 minutes later, Ethan and Emily were sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by construction paper, markers, glue, printed photographs, and half-finished notes. Sophie looked devastated when they first arrived home, but Ethan refused to let her give up. Tell me about the project, he said. Sophie wiped her eyes and pointed to the damaged materials. It was about clean water systems. Ethan listened carefully as she explained her research. The more she spoke, the more impressed he became. This is excellent work, he told her. The project may be damaged, but the ideas are not. Sophie looked uncertain. But the competition is tomorrow morning. Then we have a mission, Ethan replied. And missions require teamwork. For the next several hours, nobody mentioned billion-dollar companies or broken trust. They focused entirely on helping Sophie rebuild what had been lost. Emily watched in amazement as Ethan rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside them. He cut poster board, organized information, searched for replacement images, and even drove across town shortly before a store closed to buy supplies they needed. Several times his phone rang. Each time he silenced it without looking. Around 10 o'clock, a message appeared on the screen. Emily accidentally glanced at it. The subject line referenced an international board meeting scheduled for early the next morning. Should you answer that? She asked. Ethan barely looked up from the table. No, it seems important. Sophie is important. The simple response caught Emily off guard. Most people in Ethan's position would have delegated the project to someone else. Instead, he was sitting on a kitchen chair helping an 8-year-old finish a science presentation. Near midnight, Sophie finally began smiling again. The project looked better than it had before. She carefully reviewed each section and nodded proudly. We did it. You did it, Ethan corrected. We just helped. Sophie threw her arms around him without hesitation. Ethan froze for a second before returning the hug. Emily noticed something in his expression that she had never seen before. Happiness. Not the polished smile he showed during meetings or public appearances, but genuine happiness. The next morning they arrived at the competition together. Parents, teachers, and students filled the school gymnasium. Sophie proudly displayed her rebuilt presentation while judges moved from table to table. Ethan stood quietly beside Emily as they waited. You know, Emily said softly, you could have been anywhere in the world last night. Ethan looked toward Sophie. There was nowhere else I wanted to be. Several hours later, the awards ceremony began. Sophie did not win first place. She finished second. Yet when her name was announced, she reacted as though she had won the entire competition. She rushed toward Emily and Ethan with tears of excitement in her eyes. I did it, she shouted. Ethan laughed. You absolutely did. Watching them together, Emily felt something inside her change. The anger she had carried since discovering Ethan's secret began to fade. Not because he was wealthy, not because he was successful, but because when it truly mattered, he showed up. He chose people over status. He chose a little girl over a board meeting. And in that moment, Emily realized she was no longer questioning who Ethan Brooks really was. She was finally beginning to see exactly who he had been all along. Over the following months, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost unbelievable to Emily. Ethan became a steady presence in their lives, never forcing his way into their world and never making promises he could not keep. He attended Sophie's school events when his schedule allowed, helped with homework on video calls when he was traveling, and somehow always remembered the little things that mattered. The trust that had been damaged slowly rebuilt itself, one action at a time. Then, one spring evening, Brooks Global hosted a major charity gala supporting educational programs for children. Ethan invited Emily as his guest. At first she resisted. Large events filled with executives, cameras, and wealthy donors were far outside her comfort zone. But Ethan gently encouraged her, and eventually she agreed. The ballroom was stunning, filled with elegant decorations and hundreds of guests. As Emily entered beside Ethan, she felt nervous. Then something unexpected happened. Across the room, she recognized a familiar face. Ryan, the same man who had walked away from her months earlier. For a moment, Emily considered leaving. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and kept walking. Ryan noticed her almost immediately. His expression shifted from surprise to disbelief as he watched her standing beside Ethan Brooks. He approached cautiously. "Emily," he said. "Wow, it has been a while." Emily smiled politely. "Hello, Ryan." His eyes moved toward Ethan. "You know Ethan Brooks?" Before Emily could answer, Ethan extended his hand. "It is nice to meet you." Ryan looked increasingly uncomfortable. The conversation lasted less than a minute before he excused himself. Emily felt no satisfaction in embarrassing him. In fact, she felt almost nothing at all. The opinions that had once hurt her no longer carried weight. Later that evening, Ethan stepped onto the stage to thank guests for supporting the charity. After the applause faded, he surprised everyone by setting his prepared remarks aside. He looked directly toward Emily. "Before tonight ends, there is something important I want to say." The room grew quiet. Emily felt her heart begin to race. Ethan walked down from the stage and crossed the ballroom floor. Every guest watched in silence. When he reached her, he took her hand. "The night we met, I witnessed someone fail to see your value. What I saw was a woman with strength, kindness, courage, and an extraordinary heart. I saw a mother who would do anything for her daughter. And over time, I fell in love with both of you." Emily felt tears forming. Sophie, who was standing nearby with a family friend, covered her mouth in shock. Ethan reached into his pocket and lowered himself onto one knee. A collective gasp moved through the crowd. "Emily Carter," he said softly, "you changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. Will you marry me?" For a second the world seemed to stop. Then Emily nodded through tears. "Yes, of course I will." The ballroom erupted into applause. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to embrace her. Moments later, Sophie ran forward and wrapped her arms around both of them. Ethan smiled down at her. "Looks like we are officially a team." Sophie grinned. "I was hoping you would say that." As the celebration continued around them, Emily thought back to the painful night when she had been rejected and humiliated in front of strangers. At the time, it felt like the end of something. In reality, it had been the beginning. Because sometimes the people who fail to recognize your worth simply make room for the people who truly will.